Crack! Crack! Pharaoh smiled as he watched his slaves working in the hot desert air. Pharaoh was the king of Egypt. He quite liked running a whole country with thousands of slaves to do all the hard work for him. Pharaoh pointed at a slave who was working too slowly. His guard sprang into action. "Get moving!" shouted the guard as he cracked his whip. Pharaoh grinned smugly. He had enjoyed life in Egypt like this for many years. But these slaves were actually God's people. Surely making bricks for Pharaoh wasn't what God had promised them. As they groaned with exhaustion and hunger, they wondered if God cared about them at all. What's that? Moses was also one of God's people, and one day he saw a very strange sight. He had been out in the desert looking after some sheep when he noticed a bush. But this was no ordinary bush. This bush was on fire. But this was no ordinary fire. This fire was not burning up the bush. Instead, the bush continued to stand there, good as new. Moses edged closer to see how this was happening. All of a sudden, Moses, the bush spoke. That was something bushes certainly never do. Here I am, said Moses. The voice said, "Don't come any closer." Moses stood and stared. The voice from the burning bush continued. "Moses, take off your sandals. This is a holy place." Moses didn't have to be told twice. Off they came. "I am the God of your father, Abraham." Now Moses was terrified. God, the same God who made the promises to Abraham, was speaking to him from a bush. So Moses hid his face, and from out of the bush, God made an amazing promise. "I have heard the cry of my people. I'm concerned for them. I love them. So I have come to rescue them. And now I'm going to send you to Pharaoh to bring my people out of Egypt." Wow, what an amazing promise. God did love his people. He was going to rescue them from Pharaoh. He was going to keep his promise. Excuse me, Pharaoh, sir? Moses was standing in the palace of Pharaoh, and he was scared. He was about to tell the most powerful man in the world what to do. This is what God says. Let my people go. Pharaoh scoffed.
Ha! Who is this God? Why should I listen to him?
So instead of letting God's people go, Pharaoh made them work even harder. Crack! Crack! It was like Moses' job had failed. But God loved his people. He was going to keep his promise. Excuse me, Pharaoh? Moses was standing, waiting for Pharaoh at the mighty River Nile.
You again?
Yes, you ask, who is this God and why should you listen to him?
Yes, what about it?
God says, this is how you'll know that I am God. Then Moses held out his staff and touched the water of the Nile. Immediately, the River Nile, the great river in Egypt, turned to blood. In fact, all the water in the whole land turned to blood. Surely that would make Pharaoh let God's people go.
Ha!
Pharaoh scoffed. He wouldn't let them go. But God loved his people, and he was going to keep his promise. Frogs!
Frogs?
Frogs! Moses had come back for more. God says, let my people go, or I'll send frogs throughout your whole country.
Ha!
Pharaoh ignored him. So just as God said, frogs appeared everywhere.
All right!
Screamed Pharaoh.
Please, pray to your God to take the frogs away, and then I'll let your people go.
So Moses prayed and God made all the frogs go away. But then...
Actually, no, I won't let your people go.
Pharaoh changed his mind. It seemed God's people would never escape. But God loved them. He was still going to keep his promise.
You again? Are Are you kidding me?
God says, let my people go.
And I have told you, no, no, no.
But God was not going to give up, so he sent warning after warning. There were gnats. Zzz, annoying buzzing insects everywhere. Zzz. God says, let my people go.
And I have told you, no, no, no.
After the gnats, flies. Bzzz. Swat. Ah! Buzz. Swat, swat. God says, let my people go.
And I have told you, no, no, no.
After that, all the animals of Egypt fell sick. Let them go.
No.
Then the Egyptians were covered with boils, like scabs, but much more disgusting. Go?
No.
Bang, bang, plonk. A huge hailstorm swept through Egypt and destroyed the trees and crops. But even then, go?
No.
Anything that hadn't been destroyed by the hail was eaten by locusts. Munch, 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 munch.
No.
Then everything turned black. God made everything go dark. So dark, nobody could see anything. They couldn't leave their homes for 3 days.
Oh, stop my toe. Oh, what's going on?
But still, God says, let my people go.
No, no, no.
Nothing seemed able to change Pharaoh's mind. But God loved his people. He was going to keep his promises. Pharaoh? Moses approached the angry king once more.
What now?
God says, let my people go.
How many times do I have to
Be quiet! God says, if you don't, there will be one more plague.
What?
The firstborn son in every family will die. But none of this will happen to God's people. Then you will know that God loves his people and he will rescue them. Surely that would make Pharaoh let God's people go?
Get out of my sight!
Pharaoh just would not listen. So God had to act in one more powerful way to show that he loved his people, and he was going to keep his promise.
Go. Just go.
During the night, just as God had warned, all the firstborn males died. Every one, including Pharaoh's own son. In every house, people were crying. So, in the middle of the night, Pharaoh called for Moses.
Go. Just leave. All of you.
It had taken such a terrible thing, but God loved his people. He had kept his promise. They were leaving Egypt at last. The sound of horses' hooves filled the air. God's people had escaped from Egypt. But Pharaoh had changed his mind again. It had been days since they had made their way out of Egypt. God had kept his promise, but now Pharaoh and his army were chasing them down. And to make matters worse, on one side were Pharaoh and his army, and on the other side was an uncrossable sea. They were trapped. There seemed to be no way to escape. But as always, God loved his people, and he was going to keep his promise. God had done it! As long as God's people existed, they would talk about this moment. God threw Pharaoh and his army into confusion. Then he sent a huge wind which split the sea in two. God made a road right through the middle, so Moses and God's people walked safely across. But Pharaoh just wouldn't learn. He and all his army chased God's people into the sea. Once God's people were safely on the other side, God commanded Moses, "Hold out your staff." And as soon as he did, the waves came crashing back down, sweeping Pharaoh's army away. God loved his people, and so he kept his promise.